What if a simple act of kindness led you to an unexpected treasure? When young Sam helps Mrs. Thompson with her groceries, she gives him a small token of gratitude, just a worn wooden coin. But as Sam uncovers the mystery behind this ancient artifact, he realizes it's far more valuable than he ever imagined. The summer sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the city streets. Sam, a boy of 11, ambled down the sidewalk, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he kicked a small stone along his path. School was out, and the days stretched before him like a vast, unexplored landscape. Yet, for all the freedom summer offered, Sam felt a deep sense of loneliness. His parents were always busy, leaving him to his own devices. His friends were scattered, each off on their own summer adventures, and Sam found himself alone, the silence of the empty streets pressing in on him. As he turned a corner onto a quieter street, something caught his eye, a small figure at the far end of the block, hunched and moving slowly. It was an elderly woman, her steps unsteady as she struggled with two large grocery bags. The bags looked heavy, far too heavy for someone of her age and stature. She was nearing a crosswalk, but each step seemed to take a tremendous effort. Sam paused, a knot of concern tightening in his chest. She looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her burden. Without a second thought, Sam jogged toward her. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly, a tiny woman, probably in her late 70s or early 80s, with a thin frame and wisps of white hair escaping from under a faded blue hat. Her clothes were simple, a plain skirt and blouse, the kind of attire that spoke of a different era. But it was her face that caught Sam's attention, a mix of determination and weariness, a life lived in every wrinkle, yet with eyes that still held a spark of vitality. "Excuse me, ma'am," Sam said as he approached, his voice tentative but kind. "Do you need some help with those bags?" The woman stopped and looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing the offer, but then she nodded. "That would be very kind of you, young man," she replied, her voice soft and a little breathless. Sam reached out and took one of the bags from her, wincing slightly at its unexpected weight. "Wow, these are heavy. Where are you headed?" "Just a few blocks up," she said, pointing down the street. "I live in that building over there, the one with the green awnings." Sam nodded and adjusted his grip on the bag. "I can carry both if you want," he offered, noticing how frail she seemed. She shook her head with a small smile. No, I can manage one. I'm not as strong as I used to be, but I'm not helpless. Just a little slower these days." As they walked together, Sam found himself thinking of his grandparents, who lived far away. He hadn't seen them in a long time, and the thought of them growing old and frail without him there to help sent a pang of guilt through him. He looked over at Mrs. Thompson and realized that helping her wasn't just the right thing to do, it felt like he was helping his own grandparents in some small way. "What's your name?" the woman asked after a few minutes, her tone conversational, as if trying to ease the quiet between them. "Sam," he replied. "And yours?" "Mrs. Thompson," she said. "Though most people just call me Rose." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Thompson," Sam said, offering a polite smile. "And you as well, Sam," she responded, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she returned the smile. "You don't see many young people willing to help out these days. It's a nice change." Sam shrugged, a little embarrassed by the praise. "It just seemed like the right thing to do," he said, his voice modest. Mrs. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, as if his words had confirmed something she already believed. "It is the right thing to do," she agreed. "But that doesn't make it any less special. It's important to help when we can, even in small ways. You never know what difference it might make." Sam absorbed her words in silence, feeling a warmth in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. There was something comforting about her presence, like talking to a grandmother he never had. As they continued walking, Sam found himself curious about her life. There was an air of mystery around Mrs. Thompson, something that made him want to know more. "Have you lived here long?" Sam asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Oh, quite some time," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. I moved here with my husband after the war. We built our life in that little apartment. Raised a family, worked hard, and now, well, now it's just me. Sam sensed the weight behind her words, the loneliness that came with them, but Mrs. Thompson didn't dwell on it. She seemed at peace, or at least resigned, with her solitude. Do you have any family nearby? He asked cautiously. My children are grown and have their own lives, she said, a touch of sadness in her voice. They visit when they can, but they're busy, you know. Everyone's always so busy these days. Sam nodded, understanding in a way that was deeper than his years. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, letting the silence settle around them again. They were nearing Mrs. Thompson's building now, the green awnings visible just ahead. When they reached the entrance, Mrs. Thompson stopped and turned to Sam, her expression softening with gratitude. Thank you, Sam, she said earnestly. I don't know what I would have done without your help today. It was no trouble at all, Sam replied, feeling a little shy under her gaze. Mrs. Thompson smiled and patted his arm gently. You're a good boy, Sam. It's nice to see that kindness hasn't gone out of the world. Sam smiled back, a little unsure how to respond to such praise. I'm glad I could help, he said simply. Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, as if considering something, and then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. Here, she said, holding it out to him. I'd like you to have this. Sam looked down at the object in her hand, a small, round coin, worn and smooth with age. It wasn't like any coin he had ever seen before. It was made of wood, intricately carved with patterns that seemed almost ancient. He looked up at Mrs. Thompson, puzzled. I can't take this, he protested, shaking his head. It looks important. Mrs. Thompson smiled again, this time with a hint of something deeper, almost secretive. It is important, she agreed. But not in the way you think. Consider it a token of my gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, it'll bring you something special in return one day. Sam hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the coin. It felt warm in his hand, as if it had been held by many others before him. He turned it over, examining the delicate carvings, still unsure what to make of it. Thank you, he said finally, looking up at Mrs. Thompson. I'll take good care of it. I'm sure you will, she said softly. You have a good heart, Sam. That's a rare thing. Sam didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. Mrs. Thompson gave him one last smile before turning toward the door. Sam watched as she slowly made her way into the building, the door closing behind her with a soft click. As he walked back down the street, the wooden coin still clutched in his hand, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The world seemed a little different, as if the encounter with Mrs. Thompson had opened up a new possibility, something just beyond his understanding. The coin felt heavy in his pocket, but not in a burdensome way, more like it carried with it a promise, a connection to something greater than himself. Sam didn't know what that something was, but he had a feeling he would find out soon enough. For now, though, he simply walked home, the afternoon sun warm on his back, and the world full of quiet, unspoken potential. The days following Sam's encounter with Mrs. Thompson unfolded like any typical summer vacation. The sun rose high and lingered long, and the air hummed with the sounds of laughter, lawn mowers, and distant music from open windows. Yet, something in Sam's world had subtly shifted, a quiet undercurrent of curiosity that he couldn't quite shake. It was the small wooden coin, now safely tucked away in his room, that occupied his thoughts more than anything else. Sam had placed the coin on his nightstand, where it caught the light from his window, casting a soft glow across the carved patterns. He would often find himself staring at it, trying to decipher the meaning behind the intricate design. The carvings seemed almost ancient, like something from a time long forgotten, and the more he looked at them, the more they drew him in. On one particularly hot afternoon, when the heat seemed to press down on the city like a heavy blanket, Sam found himself alone in his room, the sound of cicadas buzzing through the open window. He picked up the coin and turned it over in his hand, tracing the grooves with his fingers. It felt strange to think that this small, seemingly insignificant object had been a part of Mrs. Thompson's life for so long, and now it was a part of his. Curiosity finally got the better of him. He decided to learn more about the coin, hoping to uncover its origin or at least understand why Mrs. Thompson had given it to him. The first place that came to mind was the internet. Sam powered up his computer and typed a description of the coin into the search engine, hoping to find something that matched. But after scrolling through page after page of results, he came up with nothing. There were plenty of sites about ancient coins, relics, and artifacts, but none of them resembled the coin in his possession. It was frustrating, and Sam felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped for a quick answer, something that would explain the coin's significance, but the mystery only deepened. He considered asking his parents, but something held him back. His parents, always preoccupied with their own responsibilities, might not understand why the small, old coin had captivated his imagination so intensely. He didn't want to bother them with something that might seem trivial to them. Sam was used to figuring things out on his own. He was used to his independence. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Sam decided to visit someone who might have more insight. His grandfather, who lived just a few blocks away, was known for his love of history and old things. Sam had spent countless afternoons in his grandfather's study, surrounded by dusty books and strange artifacts collected over the years. If anyone could help him, it would be Grandpa. After dinner, Sam told his parents he was heading out for a bit and walked over to his grandfather's house. The familiar creak of the front gate welcomed him as he pushed it open, and the scent of freshly mowed grass filled the air. His grandfather's house was a modest one-story with ivy creeping up the brick walls, a place where time seemed to slow down. Sam knocked on the door, and a moment later, his grandfather appeared, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Sam! What brings you here, buddy?" "Hey, Grandpa," Sam greeted him, feeling a little nervous about the coin but excited too. "I wanted to ask you about something." "Sure thing, come on in." His grandfather stepped aside, letting Sam into the cool, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with old photographs, and the wooden floors creaked underfoot as they made their way to the study. The study was just as Sam remembered it, shelves crammed with books, antique maps hanging on the walls, and various trinkets scattered across the large oak desk in the center. His grandfather's love of history was evident in every corner of the room. "So, what's on your mind?" his grandfather asked, settling into a leather armchair and motioning for Sam to do the same. Sam pulled the coin from his pocket and held it out. "I wanted to know if you could tell me anything about this. A lady I helped out gave it to me, and I can't figure out what it is." His grandfather took the coin, examining it closely. The room fell silent as he turned it over in his hands, his brow furrowing in concentration. Sam watched him intently, hoping for some recognition, some spark of familiarity. After a few moments, his grandfather leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Well, it's not a coin in the traditional sense. More of a token, I'd say. These carvings, they're quite unusual. Almost looks like something from an old culture, maybe Native American, or perhaps even older." "Older?" Sam's interest piqued. "Like how old?" "It's hard to say," his grandfather replied, still studying the coin. "The craftsmanship suggests it's been passed down through many generations. But it's definitely not something you'd find in any ordinary collection." Sam felt a mix of excitement and frustration. The coin was unique, that much was clear, but its true origin remained elusive. "Why would Mrs. Thompson give this to me?" he wondered aloud. His grandfather smiled gently. "Maybe she saw something in you, something that told her you'd appreciate it, that you'd take care of it. Sometimes, people pass down these kinds of things not because of what they are, but because of what they mean." Sam nodded, though he still didn't fully understand. "So, you don't know where it's from?" "I'm afraid not," his grandfather admitted. "But I can tell you this, it's important to someone, and now it's important to you. If you want to learn more, you might need to dig a little deeper. Talk to Mrs. Thompson again, see if she'll tell you more about it." Or maybe visit the local library, see if they have anything on ancient symbols. Sam thanked his grandfather and pocketed the coin once more, feeling a little more determined now. The mystery wasn't going to solve itself, and he was beginning to realize that the journey to uncover the coin's origins might be just as important as the answer itself. As he walked home in the cool evening air, the coin pressing against his leg, Sam's mind raced with possibilities. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, the way she had smiled when she handed him the coin, as if she knew it would lead him on this path. There was more to this story, and Sam was determined to uncover it. That night, as he lay in bed, Sam replayed the events of the past few days in his mind. The coin seemed to have a gravity all its own, pulling him deeper into its mystery. And with each passing day, Sam felt that he was inching closer to something big, something that would change the way he saw the world. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the right moment, the right clue to present itself. The summer nights were long, and Sam had plenty of time to think, to plan, and to wonder just what secrets the coin held, and why it had found its way to him. The following morning, Sam woke early, the first rays of sunlight barely peeking through his curtains. Sleep had been elusive, his mind too full of questions to settle into the peaceful rhythm of rest. The coin sat on his nightstand, a silent reminder of the mystery that now consumed him. He couldn't ignore the pull any longer, he needed to know more. As he got dressed, Sam decided to follow his grandfather's advice. The library seemed like the best place to start, a treasure trove of knowledge just waiting to be uncovered. The town library wasn't far, only a short bike ride away, and Sam knew it well. He had spent countless afternoons there as a younger kid, lost in books about dinosaurs, space, and whatever other topics had caught his fancy. But today, his mission was different. He was after something specific, something that would shed light on the strange token now weighing heavily in his pocket. After a quick breakfast, Sam grabbed his backpack, slipped the coin inside, and headed out the door. The morning air was crisp, the remnants of dawn still lingering as he pedaled down the quiet streets. There was a sense of purpose in his movements, a determination that had taken root overnight. The library loomed ahead, an old brick building with ivy creeping up its sides, its tall windows reflecting the morning sun. Sam parked his bike and walked up the steps, the heavy wooden doors creaking as he pushed them open. Inside, the library was cool and quiet, the air thick with the scent of old paper and polished wood. The librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, looked up from her desk as he entered, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Morning, Sam," she greeted him with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you around here in a while. What brings you in today?" "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Sam replied, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "I'm looking for some books about ancient symbols or maybe old tokens. I have something I'm trying to figure out." Mrs. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. "That sounds interesting. I think I have just the thing. Follow me." She led Sam down the rows of bookshelves, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. They reached a section near the back of the library, where the shelves were filled with dusty, well-worn books. Mrs. Jenkins ran her finger along the spines, muttering to herself as she searched for the right one. "Ah, here we are," she said finally, pulling out a large, leather-bound volume. "This should help. It's a comprehensive guide to ancient symbols and their meanings. It might be a bit dense, but if anyone can make sense of it, it's you." Sam took the book from her with a grateful smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll give it a try. If you need anything else, just let me know," she said, patting his shoulder before heading back to her desk. Sam found a quiet corner of the library, tucked away between the shelves, and settled into one of the old, plush chairs. He placed the book on the table in front of him, its cover thick with dust. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling softly under his fingers. The book was filled with illustrations and descriptions, each one more intricate than the last. It was like stepping into another world, a world of ancient knowledge and forgotten histories. For the next few hours, Sam pored over the book, comparing the symbols in its pages to the carvings on the coin. Some were similar, but none were an exact match. The patterns on the coin seemed to defy categorization, blending elements of different cultures and time periods in a way that didn't quite make sense. It was both frustrating and fascinating, as if the coin was playing a game of hide and seek with him. Just as he was about to close the book in defeat, a particular illustration caught his eye. It was a small drawing, almost hidden among the larger, more detailed symbols. It depicted a simple, circular design, not unlike the one on his coin, but with an added element, a small, spiral pattern at its center. The accompanying text described it as an ancient symbol of unity, used by a forgotten civilization to represent the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. Sam's heart skipped a beat as he read the description. While it wasn't an exact match, it felt close, closer than anything else he had found so far. The idea of the coin being a symbol of connection intrigued him, aligning with the way Mrs. Thompson had spoken about it. Could this be the key to understanding why she had given it to him? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more tantalizing than the last. But before he could delve any deeper, he heard the soft chime of the library's clock, signaling the top of the hour. Sam realized he had been in the library for most of the morning, and the time had slipped away unnoticed. He quickly jotted down the details of the symbol in his notebook, determined to follow this new lead. As he made his way back to the front of the library, Mrs. Jenkins looked up from her desk. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, her tone both knowing and encouraging. "Sort of," Sam replied, slipping the book back onto the shelf. "I think I've got a lead." "Thanks for your help." "Anytime, Sam. You're always welcome here." Sam nodded and headed out the door, the bright afternoon sun greeting him as he stepped outside. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to fall into place. But there was still so much he didn't understand, so many questions left unanswered. On his way home, Sam found himself replaying his conversations with Mrs. Thompson in his mind. Her words seemed to take on new meaning in light of what he had discovered. The coin wasn't just a simple token, it was a symbol, a connection to something bigger than either of them. But what was that connection? And why had she chosen him to be its keeper? Sam knew he couldn't find the answers on his own. He needed to talk to Mrs. Thompson again, to learn more about the coin's history and why she had entrusted it to him. The thought filled him with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He wasn't sure how she would react to his questions, or if she would even have the answers he was looking for. But he had to try. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets, Sam's resolve hardened. Tomorrow, he would visit Mrs. Thompson. He would ask her about the coin, about its origins, and about the connection it represented. He had a feeling that whatever she told him would change everything. With the coin once again tucked safely in his pocket, Sam pedaled home, the warm breeze brushing against his face. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The coin had brought him this far, and now it was leading him towards something greater, something he could feel just beyond the horizon. And Sam was ready to follow wherever it led. The next day, Sam awoke with a clear sense of purpose. The previous day's discoveries at the library had only deepened his curiosity, and now, the need to understand the true significance of the coin was undeniable. After a quick breakfast, he slipped the coin into his pocket, feeling its familiar weight against his leg. The day was already warm, the summer heat settling in early, but Sam hardly noticed. His thoughts were entirely focused on what lay ahead: another visit to Mrs. Thompson. The walk to Mrs. Thompson's apartment felt different this time. The last time, he had stumbled upon her by chance, but now, he was driven by a purpose he could barely explain to himself. The buildings and streets blurred into the background as he replayed the conversation he intended to have. He wasn't sure how she would react to his questions. Would she be willing to share more, or had she already told him everything he needed to know? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he knew he had to try. When he reached her building, Sam paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath. The green awnings cast cool shadows over the front steps, and for a moment, he hesitated. What if she didn't remember him? What if she didn't want to talk about the coin? The question swirled in his mind, but he shook them off, reminding himself of the quiet determination that had brought him this far. Gathering his courage, Sam pressed the button for her apartment. The intercom crackled to life after a moment, and Mrs. Thompson's familiar voice came through, a little muffled but warm. "Yes? Who is it?" "Hi, Mrs. Thompson." "It's Sam," he said, his voice steady but laced with a touch of nervousness. "I was hoping I could talk to you about something. If you're not too busy, I mean." There was a brief pause, then the sound of the door unlocking. "Of course, Sam. Come on up." Sam pushed the door open and stepped inside, the cool air of the building a welcome contrast to the heat outside. He made his way up the stairs to the second floor, the old wooden steps creaking slightly underfoot. When he reached Mrs. Thompson's door, it was already ajar, and she was waiting for him with a gentle smile. "Come in, Sam," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "It's nice to see you again." "Thanks," Sam replied, stepping into the small but cozy apartment. The living room was just as he remembered it, cluttered with books and knickknacks, the furniture worn but comfortable. It felt like a place filled with stories, each object carrying its own piece of history. Mrs. Thompson led him to the same worn armchair he had sat in before, while she settled into the one across from him. "What brings you here today?" she asked, her tone curious but patient. Sam hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin. He held it out to her, the carved patterns catching the light as it rested in his palm. "I've been thinking a lot about this," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I went to the library yesterday, trying to learn more about it. I found some things, but I still don't really understand. I was hoping you could tell me more about where it came from, and why you gave it to me." Mrs. Thompson took the coin from his hand, her fingers brushing against his as she did so. She studied it for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, as if she were looking not just at the coin, but at something beyond it, something only she could see. "This coin has been in my family for a very long time," she said finally, her voice soft, almost reverent. "It was passed down from my grandmother to my mother, and then to me. Each of us has kept it, not because of its material value, but because of what it represents." Sam listened intently, his heart beating faster as she spoke. "What does it represent?" he asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "It represents a connection," she said, her voice growing a bit stronger, more certain. "A connection between the past and the present, between the physical world and something greater. It's a reminder that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves. My grandmother always believed that this coin had the power to find its way to the right person, someone who would understand its true meaning." Sam felt a shiver run down his spine, the weight of her words sinking in. "But why me?" he asked, struggling to comprehend what she was saying. "I'm just a kid. Why would you give something so important to me?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes that made Sam feel as though she were seeing something in him that he couldn't see in himself. "Because, Sam, I saw and knew what my grandmother must have seen in my mother, and what my mother saw in me. Kindness, curiosity, and a heart that's open to the world. These qualities are rare, especially in someone so young. The coin chose you, in a way, just as it chose each of us before you." Sam was silent, trying to process what she had said. It felt overwhelming, the idea that this small, simple object could carry so much meaning, that it could somehow choose him. He thought back to the symbol he had found in the library, the connection it represented. It all seemed to fit together, but there were still so many pieces missing, so much he didn't understand. "Do you know where it came from originally?" Sam asked after a moment, his voice tentative. Mrs. Thompson shook her head slowly. "I don't know exactly. My grandmother told me that it came from a time long before any of us, from a people who understood the world in ways we've forgotten. She said it was meant to remind us of the importance of staying connected to each other, to our past, and to the world around us." Sam nodded, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in his mind. The coin wasn't just a relic or a piece of history, it was a message, a reminder of the values that connected people across generations. And somehow, it had found its way to him. Mrs. Thompson reached out and placed the coin back in his hand, closing his fingers around it gently. "I believe it's in good hands now," she said softly. "What you do with it is up to you. It's not about finding all the answers, Sam. Sometimes, it's about carrying the message forward, keeping it alive for those who come after you." Sam felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of responsibility that was both daunting and reassuring. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But he understood now that the coin was more than just an object, it was a connection, a legacy, and it was his turn to be its keeper. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound sense of purpose. "I'll take care of it, I promise." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a smile that seemed to hold years of wisdom and understanding. "I know you will, Sam. I know you will." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon sun filtering through the window and casting a warm glow over the room. Sam felt a deep sense of peace, a calm that came from knowing he was part of something larger than himself, something that had been passed down through generations. As he stood to leave, Mrs. Thompson walked him to the door, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're always welcome here, Sam," she said as they reached the door. "And if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." "I will," Sam promised, giving her one last smile before stepping out into the bright sunlight. As he walked home, the coin tucked safely in his pocket, Sam felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The coin had found its way to him, and now it was his turn to carry its message forward, to be a part of the connection that spanned across time. And somehow, Sam knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would continue to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The days after Sam's conversation with Mrs. Thompson were filled with a sense of calm purpose. The mystery of the coin had settled into something deeper, more profound. It was no longer just about uncovering the coin's origins, it was about understanding the connection it represented, the link between past and present, between generations, and between people. Sam carried the coin with him everywhere, feeling its reassuring weight in his pocket, a silent reminder of the responsibility he now held. But as much as Sam had learned, there was still a nagging sense that something remained unfinished. He found himself thinking more and more about what Mrs. Thompson had said, about carrying the message forward, and he began to wonder how he could do that. The coin had been passed down through generations, each person leaving their mark on its story. Now it was his turn, but he didn't know where to begin. One warm evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Sam decided to take a walk. The streets were bathed in the golden light of dusk, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets chirping and the distant laughter of children playing. Sam walked without any particular destination in mind, letting his feet guide him. The coin was in his pocket, as always, and he found himself absent-mindedly tracing the carvings with his fingers. As he walked, Sam's thoughts drifted back to the first time he had met Mrs. Thompson, how he had helped her with her groceries without a second thought. That simple act of kindness had set everything in motion, leading him to this moment. He realized now that the connection the coin represented wasn't just about the past, it was about the choices we make every day, the small acts that bind us together. Lost in thought, Sam almost didn't notice when he wandered into the old neighborhood park. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, a small green space tucked away between rows of houses. The park was quiet now, the swings empty, the playground deserted. Sam found a bench under a large oak tree and sat down, the coin still clutched in his hand. He sat there for a while, letting the peacefulness of the park wash over him. The sky was a deep, rich blue, the first stars beginning to twinkle above. As he watched the day fade into night, Sam began to feel a sense of clarity, as if the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, about her quiet strength and the wisdom she had shared with him. He thought about his grandfather, and the way he had encouraged Sam to follow his curiosity. And he thought about the coin, about what it had meant to each person who had held it before him. Suddenly, the answer seemed so obvious that Sam wondered how he hadn't seen it before. The coin wasn't just a relic to be studied or a mystery to be solved. It was a gift, a symbol of the connections that bind people together across time. And the best way to honor that connection was to pass it on, to continue the legacy that had been entrusted to him. Sam stood up from the bench, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He knew what he had to do, and he knew exactly who he needed to talk to. The next morning, Sam woke early, filled with a sense of determination. After breakfast, he grabbed his backpack, slipping the coin inside, and headed out the door. This time, his destination was clear: he was going to visit his grandfather. The walk to his grandfather's house felt different today. The same streets and houses, the same familiar sights, but everything seemed sharper, more vibrant. When Sam reached the front gate, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then he pushed the gate open and walked up the path, the gravel crunching under his feet. His grandfather answered the door almost immediately, a look of surprise and then delight crossing his face. "Sam! Back so soon? What brings you here, buddy?" "Hey, Grandpa," Sam replied, feeling a little nervous but resolute. "I need to talk to you about something. It's important." His grandfather's expression softened, and he stepped aside to let Sam in. "Of course. Come on in. Let's sit down in the study." They walked together to the study, the familiar room filled with books and memories. Sam sat down in his usual chair, his grandfather settling into the one across from him. For a moment, Sam didn't say anything, trying to find the right words. His grandfather watched him patiently, sensing that this wasn't just a casual visit. "What's on your mind, Sam?" he asked gently. Sam took a deep breath and pulled the coin out of his backpack, holding it out for his grandfather to see. "It's this. The coin Mrs. Thompson gave me. I've been thinking a lot about it, about what it means." His grandfather leaned forward, studying the coin as if seeing it for the first time. "It's a remarkable piece," he said quietly. "There's something special about it, something more than just its history." "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Sam continued, his voice steady. "I talked to Mrs. Thompson again, and she told me about how the coin's been passed down through her family, how it represents a connection between people, between generations. And I think it's supposed to be passed on again." His grandfather looked at him, a mixture of surprise and pride in his eyes. "You're right, Sam," he said after a moment. "That's a wise conclusion. The coin isn't just an artifact, it's a symbol, a way of keeping those connections alive. But who do you think should receive it next?" Sam smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I want you to have it, Grandpa. You've always taught me to be curious, to learn from the past, and to value the connections we have with each other. I think the coin belongs with you." For a moment, his grandfather was silent, clearly moved by Sam's words. Then he reached out and took the coin from Sam's hand, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you, Sam," he said softly. "This means more to me than you can imagine. I'll cherish it, and when the time is right, I'll make sure it finds its way to the next person who needs it." Sam felt a deep sense of satisfaction, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. The coin had found its new home, and with it, the legacy of connection would continue. But more than that, Sam realized that he had found his own place in that legacy, his own role in carrying the message forward. As they sat together in the study, the sun shining through the windows and casting a warm glow over the room, Sam felt a profound sense of peace. The journey of the coin wasn't over, but his part in it had reached a new chapter, one filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing. And as he looked at his grandfather, who was still holding the coin with a reverence that spoke of the generations it had touched, Sam knew that the story was far from over. The connections they shared, between past and present, between young and old, between family and friends, were what truly made life meaningful. The world was full of hidden treasures, Sam realized, but the most valuable of all were the connections we made, the kindness we shared, and the legacy we left behind. And in that moment, as he sat with his grandfather, Sam understood that he was part of something much larger than himself, a story that had begun long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. And that, he knew, was the true meaning of the coin's priceless worth.